Okay, well, thank you very much then for the invitation to give quite a short paper here on state capitalism, which in its many forms prevents a hybrid social formation, combining the political role of the state with the economic structures of capitalism. The state has played a leading role in the evolution of capitalism. Historically, the state has enforced laws on the preservation of property, provided physical force necessary to maintain order, and institutions to ensure ideological conformity. The state has regulated the economy to sustain the value of money and determine the terms of trade and relations with other states. In its neoliberal form, free enterprise capitalism relies on the state not only to make and enforce a legal and political framework, but also to extend the geographical reach of competitive capitalism. The state, moreover, can provide not only a shell for capitalism, but an alternative form of capitalism. It can produce it can own productive assets, it can promote entrepreneurship, and it can direct investment to assure the accumulation of capital. The notion of state capitalism has several conflicting meanings which need to be untangled. Some forms of what Weber called political capitalism can be excluded from capitalism in its modern sense, which we might define as continuous production for profit based on wage labor, promoting the constant accumulation of capital. Since the beginning of capitalism, states have controlled to various degrees economic enterprise. The British state, for example, and even in the 17th century, licensed the British East India Company, which later had its own private army. Following Max Weber, some contemporary writers, notably Branko Milanovic, prefer the term political capitalism, which they use to describe contemporary states which play a dominant role in the regulation of the economy. Under state capitalism, as I define it, states not only coordinate the economy, but also appropriate surplus value. In this paper, I distinguish between three social formations: state capitalism, state socialism, and state-controlled capitalism. Capitalism in its modern form we might define as an economic system with continuous production for profit, driven by a social class, furthering the constant accumulation of capital. In the modern period, state capitalism refers to the use of the state apparatus by a political class or stratum to allocate surplus value for capital accumulation and to enjoy the fruits of capitalist enterprise. The state retains legal ownership of the developed productive forces and directly controls the process of production, giving rise to surplus value, the utilization of which is determined by a political or bureaucratic class. What distinguishes state capitalism from other forms of capitalism is the ownership by the state of productive assets and control of the economic surplus by state officials who can direct it to different purposes, to variable capital, constant capital, and to the profits of enterprise. State capitalism needs to be distinguished from another form of state control, state socialism. This refers to a state which is controlled by a socialist party or organization using the state apparatus to build a socialist society. The Soviet Marxist analysis was two-dimensional. Socialism was differentiated by the class relations to the means of production and the level of productive forces. Socialism could be ensured by the replacement of the capitalist class by the working class. In practice, the ownership and control of productive forces by the party state on the one side and the advanced level of productive forces on the other. The party-controlled planning process prevented economic exploitation in a Marxist sense. This approach has legitimated the construction of socialism consequent on the destruction of the capitalist class. Sociologists such as Wladek Veselovsky contended that these conditions entailed the elimination of economic domination by the capitalist class and the appropriation of surplus value. The Marxist state capitalist critique, however, rejects this reasoning, which I will refer to later. Under state-controlled capitalism, state officials regulate and control the means of production, which consist of privately owned, profit-making enterprises in a market economy, or a market within a system of state planning. In this conjunction, the state exerts political power over the economy from which it can derive and direct surplus value. The distribution of economic surplus is determined concurrently both by a capitalist class, defined by its ownership of economic assets, and by a political class, defined by its political control over the allocation of surplus. Statist forms of capitalism arise for different reasons. The uneven world development of capitalism gave rise to economies with agrarian pre-capitalist productive forces and the absence of a bourgeois class. Capitalism, then, is created through the agency of autocratic state development. In the absence of an ascendant bourgeois class, officials with control of the state apparatuses expand the accumulation of capital and appropriate surplus value. This is what Max Weber and his followers, such as Branko Milanovic, describe as political capitalism. Writing about China, as well as about Vietnam and Singapore, Milanovic adopts the Weberian notion of political capitalism. By this he means acquisition by wealth, by force, political connection, or speculation. The bureaucracy, he claims, is clearly the primary beneficiary of the system and legitimates itself by realizing a high rate of economic growth. It exercises, unconstrained by law, power over the private sector, and this system ensures economic growth concurrently with the enrichment of the bureaucratic class. Different types of state capitalism are formed by a variety of political groups who seek to control the extraction of surplus for personal, domestic, or transnational purposes. Lenin used the term state capitalist, which he applied to Soviet Russia's new economic policy from 1921 to 1928. I'm skipping things here. Private ownership was adopted as a measure intended to move the economy from the ravages of war to maintain Bolsheviks in power. It was justified by the socialist leadership because it enabled the market and private enterprise to operate to satisfy public needs. As Lenin put it in 1921, a free market and capitalism, both subject to state control, are now being permitted and are developing. Crucially, the state, the apparatus of power, was controlled by the Communist Party, which exercised power over islands of private capitalist initiative. The political was superior to the economic. Lenin's terminology, however, is misleading and confusing. What the new economic policy introduced was a form of political socialism with capitalist economic forms, that is, state-controlled capitalism. This position marked a revision of Marxism. The political is not dependent on the economic, but when a revolutionary socialist government assumes power, it is the other way round. This role of controlling capitalist development as during new economic policy, however, has been taken by the socialist state which assumes control of market processes without owning the means of production. The Marxist state capitalist critique addresses not state-controlled capitalism, as under the new economic policy, but the state-owned and planned economy constituted in the Soviet Union and later in China and Eastern Europe. It denies the social formation of state socialism. While such critiques vindicate socialist revolutions in pre-capitalist economies, such as Soviet Russia, the policies of the new incumbents are condemned. State capitalism is defined by critical Marxists not in terms of the level of productive forces and forms of ownership and economic coordination under state planning, but by the ways political control over the labor process leads to the illegitimate appropriation of surplus value. This position enabled its adherents to praise socialist revolutions in pre-capitalist countries, but to condemn consequent developments led by communist or socialist parties as capitalist. Lenin, therefore, legitimately started a socialist revolution, but Stalin illegitimately turned it into a form of state capitalism. Critical to the theory is the role of a new ruling class. The state bureaucracy acts as an exploiting class in expropriating the profits of enterprise. The argument here is that state institutions which own the means of production are managed by a bureaucratic class which acts not only to accumulate capital, but to appropriate surplus for its own class benefit. Capitalism is not defined by the ownership of the means of production by a capitalist class, but by the form of bureaucratic exploitation in the labor process, which delivers profits of enterprise to the bureaucratic class. This idea has been put by writers such as Stephen Resnich and Richard Wolff, Dunayevskaya, Tony Cliff, Robert Brenner, and many others. The underlying assumption of these writers rests on a Weberian approach to bureaucracy and political control over the extraction of surplus value, rather than on historical materialism adopted by Soviet Marxists. Resnich and Wolff contend, for example, that state capitalism is formed by the, and here I quote, capitalist processes of producing, appropriating, and distributing surplus, which coexist and interact with processes that place state officials, rather than private individuals, in the class position of appropriators and distributors of surplus. Robert Brenner takes a similar position, defining modes of production simply as modes of labor control. And I'll miss many other discussions which take the similar line. Current Marxist writers, for instance, like Tom Rockmore, consider that the Soviet state in adopting Lenin's views is faulted because it endorses the dictatorship of the party over the working class. The relations of production then were those of self-expanding alienated labor, which were the productive relations of capital. Poverty relations do not constitute the ruling class. It is political control over the means of production which defines the ruling class, or sometimes, as defined by people like Hillel Tickton, for instance, not as a ruling elite or as ruling elites. These arguments are used by non-Marxist critics to label the state socialist societies as totalitarian. Alvin Gouldner, for instance, articulates this position when he says, quote, the bureaucracy is a new ruling class, a new, many times worse forms of domination than capitalism. Since the dismantling of the Soviet Union and the socialist states of Eastern Europe, China, which is self-defined as a socialist formation of socialism with Chinese characteristics, has become the center of Marxist debate. Since the market reforms, China is more complicated because it is a mixed system with immense and growing private ownership. Critical Marxists, however, adopt the same criteria as those applied to the Soviet Union. In terms of my terminology, they pose an alternative state-controlled capitalism, not state capitalism. In this case, the political class controls surplus in the labor process, but also there is a separate possessing class having ownership rights over the means of production. David Harvey takes a similar position when in discussing neoliberalism. He claims, as far as China is concerned, insofar as neoliberalism requires a large, easily exploited and relatively powerless labor force, then China certainly qualifies as a neoliberal economy. My own view is that this gives too much credence, these views give too much credence to the role of a political stratum or ruling elites. It ignores other constitutive features of capitalism, the form of ownership, the dominant values of society, and the way the state allocates surplus. In the Soviet context, state ownership and state coordination under an economic plan took a different form from capitalism, which in turn affected the use of economic surplus. In all social formations, part of what is produced has to be used for the reproduction of society and for the development, renewal, and maintenance of the productive forces. Hence, the labor process will entail the extraction of surplus value in all except the most primitive societies. The capitalist system is driven by a capitalist class to turn surplus product into private profit. State socialism, however, turns surplus product into social welfare and productive investment. The state bureaucracy under a socialist regime cannot own assets or transmit property through generations. It cannot form a bourgeois social class in a Marxist sense. It is a political class as understood by people like Moscow, not an economic class as defined by Marx. Members of the bureaucracy may receive excessive salaries and other benefits of office, foreign travel, superior accommodation, health benefits, and so on, but these are privileges over consumption. They are bureaucratic forms of power which are derived from hierarchical control over assets and people. However, they do not specify class position in a Marxist sense. Such administrative forms of power are real enough, and they cannot be denied. However, they are forms of bureaucratic domination, which may lead to inequalities in consumption and bureaucratic power, but not to capitalist exploitation. The crucial problem to be addressed is who owns and controls capital? How is surplus distributed and used? It is possible for a privileged stratum to seize power and utilize it illegitimately by appropriating surplus value. To distinguish state capitalism from state socialism, we need to know what proportion of surplus goes to public development, including capital accumulation, and what remains as personal wealth, which can be used for personal advance of officials, in Russian, for instance, the chinovnik class, and political advantage. My own view is that there are administrative organizational forms of domination and exploitation. They are different, however, of a qualitative type to the Marxist understanding of class exploitation. One positive consequence of the state capitalist critique is that it draws attention to the use of surplus value as profits of enterprise. It provides a measure for distinguishing between capitalism and socialism. A weakness of current versions, however, is that very few, if any, do actually measure the extent of economic exploitation. And finally, I would hope that these topics will be addressed by other subjects in following presentations.